Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade. This is the Education Show, and I'm here with Karina Elwood. Karina, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We're here to talk about all sorts of things, but first things first. What's your take on the state of education journalism right now?
My take on the state of education journalism right now is that we need to have more student voices. That education journalism is always better when it is elevated by student voices, whether that's in your own reporting or helping other students do the work. Like more students represented, the better the work usually is.
100% agree. Let's talk about firsthand your new gig, which is about student voices in journalism.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So it's a national like education reporting project, but it's student led. So we're essentially contracting students from around the country to do education journalism, and they will be on the ground reporting. I'll be editing, and we're in the sort of right now we're in the pitching phase. So we have our pitch form open, like welcoming students to bring us their story ideas, and we're focusing on five big themes that we're trying to focus the stories on. And those themes right now are um, they are how current events and policy is affecting classrooms. So that's everything from like how is, big things that are happening in the world being taught in the classroom to, how are those big events then affecting the culture and climate in classrooms.
Okay.
It's about how tech and AI, the next one is about tech and AI are changing classrooms. It's
Excellent.
all of the stuff that everyone wants to write about. What it's like to be a young person today. What can we capture by using student voices that sort of harnesses, like what is it like to be, Gen Z? What are the stories that we're sort of like behind the curve on that students are ahead of the curve on? And then the other one is about career technical, like in experimental learning and student engagement. So what are classrooms doing to sort of help engage students, particularly those who, might not plan to go to college? And then the last one's just like sort of open ended, like what do we not know about? The idea that the best stories are the ones we can't sort of plan for or put into sort of a category, but is something interesting happening in a classroom somewhere that we won't know about unless we hear about it from the students first.
I got so many questions, but let me start with a really simple one. Why is it called firsthand? What's so interesting or important about firsthand journalism?
Yeah, it's called firsthand because it's gonna be driven by students telling us about their firsthand experiences. They're in the classrooms, they're there experiencing it. And like I said in my take, like, oftentimes our education journalism, is missing student voices just because it's hard. Like it's hard to get into classrooms as an education journalist. It's hard to find students. There are all of these sort of elements that make it difficult to highlight student voices when the adults are the ones making the decisions. And so, what happens if we let the people who are experiencing and being affected by these policies firsthand do the reporting? And what will that look like? And will that be richer? I think it's going to be.
I love that. One of my all-time favorite education stories was done by a traditional journalist then at the Boston Globe who couldn't get into a school and who basically partnered with a student journalist to compile, sort of crowdsource a firsthand account of what it was like in that school. The student journalist detailed things, the grown-up journalist confirmed everything, and eventually got photo access. Turned into a brilliant story, and I've been wanting way more of that. And I'm so excited that you are doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I think, my interest in getting involved in this came from like a similar place of, like as an education reporter, like I was reading student papers because, they were reporting on things that, not that I wasn't, but just, that they had access to or, and, in this state of education journalism that we're in, there's just not enough of us to go around. And so there are resources to tap into, in the schools, like students. I'm a big believer that like students can do this work if we give them the resources to do. And so that's what I'm really excited that Firsthand is going to do. And I should have said this from the start, but Firsthand is a project from the Bell, which is a national or a nonprofit that is essentially training the next generation of journalists. And so they have some really great mechanisms already in place for training journalists. Most of that is local to the work they've done, and so this is sort of taking that mission and the mission of training the next generation of student journalists or of journalists and taking it sort of national. yeah, opening up that scope.
I should have mentioned that student journalists from the Bell have contributed to the grade on this topic of, hey, we're the kids in education journalism. I'm a big fan of the Bell and its work.
Yeah, I mean, like, and if you look at any of the work they're doing, it's, it's remarkable. Like, these are the stories that, like education journalists around the country are doing, and that students can do it. They just, especially, like they might not have the access to resources in their schools to have like a journalism program that's gonna, necessarily teach them like how to do it at the level that, we're gonna ask them to do. And so we're gonna provide them with some of that training and those resources, and they'll get mentorship and, a monetary stipend and all of the things you need to be supported and being able to do that. So I'm really excited about it.
Good. What else besides the authenticity of the firsthand experience do student journalists offer to traditional education journalism? I've been talking for years now about experimentation, innovation. Last week I called it modernizing the education beat. Are there any things that student journalists don't even think of as different or innovative that we could learn from them that you've been able to see so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the places or one of the themes is that sort of like what it's like to be a young person today that I wanted to sort of like sort of harness is just their ability to know what's in, like what's actually in, the idea, the like thing that I keep coming back to. I mean, it's kind of silly, but like was the like 6-7 trend that we were seeing in schools, right? And the idea is like once the media starts writing about it, like that's so in the grave for kids. Like it is like once your dad knows about it, like, it's not cool anymore.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that like it's an easy response, but like it is that young people know what young people like and want and want to read about and know what they're talking about and what's cool. And that is sort of, I think, something that we could do better about tapping into, in education journalism is like not only, and not even just education journalism, but journalism broadly is, like thinking about what do young people actually want to read instead of trying to figure out like how do we get young people to come to the traditional ways we've always done things. And that's part of the reason why we're also opening it up to any digital format. So, audio, video, traditional print, anything that students how they want to produce it, we're open to helping them learn how to produce it in that way. And like my perfect vision of this program will also have students like doing it all, right? Like because that's also what modern journalism is like, like I had to learn how to make TikToks, like, you know what I mean? Like it's, that's something that, and that's where students will reach other students and that's where they will reach other young people, right. Is the platforms that they already are and how can we adapt to those sort of, those spaces.
I've talked to a bunch of education journalists, current and former, about learning vertical video. Mandy McLaren, who was at the Globe covering education and is now editing at the Louisville Courier, she went on to TikTok looking for kids to help her reporting. She ended up finding a bunch of parents, and doing a big series on special ed. So there are also surprises in there. I think that one of the things that's exciting about what you're doing is the possibility that we'll learn new things and new approaches. Can I jump in and ask you? Well, I'm going to tell you what I think, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong. I thought the piece of education journalism that excited me the most so far in 2026 was "Can you read?" Did you follow the whole "Can you read" thing? This kid, Philadelphia kid, goes up to fellow seniors. He's a high school senior who's already gotten to college. We know what that is like. He went up to his classmates, put an index card in their hand and said, "Can you read? Can you read it?" And then the ones that could read it, pronounce it, he asked them, "Well, what does it mean?" And super non-traditional, super problematic to traditional journalistic approach, had a whole gotcha thing going on. But I thought it was really exciting, and I still want to interview that kid. I mean, my God, what an experience that must have been to go viral. But are you open to seriously non-traditional journalism?
I think I'm open to non-traditional journalism in the way that we package our journalism, but I do I do believe in like teaching in like first understanding like the basics of, traditional journalism, of like you have to understand like the ethics of journalism and all of the standards of things like, all of the basics of fact checking and neutrality, and those are the sort of the standards that journalism is built on. And I am for non-traditional journalism and experimenting with different ways of like how we package what we have. But I am still like, we have to make sure that what we have is honest and truthful and transparent, and, all of those, sort of, key pillars of journalism that
Right.
makes it the institution that it is. And I'm also a big believer that, you have to understand the rules before you can break them. And I think that in this situation, that for most high school students, like we got to learn the basics before we can break the rules. And, I think that's sort of where we start, at least for now. So, but I'm very into packaging things in different ways. When I was reporting, I was doing like always trying to think about like what are the different ways we can package stories? Like, is there a non-traditional format that we can tell this in? Can we do video? Can we do a quiz? Can we do, some sort of visual element that sort of, highlights the story? And I think that those we have to be open to, to experimenting and trying different ways, and about how we tell stories.
And it sounds like you were doing that, some of that before. Speaking of before, do you want to reflect a little bit on the highs and lows of, I think it was almost 5 years covering Northern Virginia schools for the Post? Uh,
Yeah.
are there things you did that you're still really proud of? Are there things that you learned that you do differently, or you tell someone who is coming up behind you to do differently? I'd love any reflections you're willing to share.
Yeah. So I spent 3 years on the education beat at the Post, and I was doing I was doing government reporting before that at the Post, and I think that I mean like it was just really the best experience. Like I really did learn so much about what makes a good story, and I think that the thing that I learned the most, and the thing that I think will work really well in this project as well, is like how can we find the story of education in the small stories, right? Like is how can we say something bigger with our local stories about what's happening in the state or in that locality, of really harnessing sort of like that nut graph. And that was always the challenge, for me at the Post, was like, okay, that's a Virginia education story, but how can we, make that a Washington Post Virginia education story, right? And I was always having that sort of conversation, and that's a skill that I think translates really well into this project, a national reporting initiative. Like, how can we take the experiences that students are having in their classrooms, and like what can we say about the state of education, and how can we help them sort of connect those dots to see the trends in the sort of that bigger picture of like what is actually happening. Yeah, and it really was just like the best experience, and I had the best colleagues, and they're still doing really great education work, and I'm always cheering for them. So I think yeah, it was a great time, and I learned so much.
Um, uh, I'm, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying about finding the big and the little, and finding the Post story. I was a big fan of. She didn't stay on the education beat for very long, but there was a education reporter at WBEZ Chicago, sort of an education meets youth culture reporter. She was only there for 6 months or a year, but she wrote at least a couple stories that I still remember all these years later. I think her name was Isabel Marino.
Mm,
She wrote about kids wearing hoodies in the hot weather. Like, why did they do that? It is hot out.
right.
Fascinating story. Um, and she wrote a story about a haircut that was super popular, that was also to adults and parents super ugly, that a lot of boys were wearing, the name of which I've forgotten. Is that what you mean about finding the big and the little, or do you mean something else?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think those are definitely good examples when they sort of have like those universal themes. The idea, did I lose? Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so those universal themes about, what these small moments, right? Like I always think about like looking for, yeah, like a small moment, like sure, like why do students wear hoodies in the heat, and what is that small moment? That might be a local story that you're seeing here, but like can you pull that back and say like, oh, that's happening everywhere, or that might be happening at one school, and can you pull that back and say like, is that happening at other schools in the district? Of always sort of like not, the way I would describe it is like the story has to often say something about more than just one person, right? Like it has to sort of say something about what's happening, right? And that was always the challenge. It is like, it's like finding a nut graph, right? Like if in, especially in education, you know, there are moments of like true breaking news, but a lot of the work, it doesn't, it isn't, you know, like breaking news in the way that, like the public safety beat is, you know what I mean? And so you have to have a nut graph to those stories. You have to tell, especially right now, you have to tell your readers why does it matter to them? And if they don't live in Virginia, if they don't live in Chicago, like why should they still read that? Like why is that still interesting? Is because it's saying something broader about kids today, or what it's like to be. That was a story I was always looking for, is like how can we capture what it's like to be a young person in 2026? And like those can be small moments happening, you know, in the schools that I cover, but you know, you could pick them up and drop them into any school in the country and they would resonate in the same way with the same communities.
We'll obviously look to firsthand for examples of this in the future. Are there any folks who are already out there exemplifying temporarily, occasionally, or in an ongoing way? Are there folks that are already doing this that we could think about? Part of me thinks about Teen Vogue for some reason. Rest in peace. Are there other names or outlets that you're trying to sort of vibe with?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the youth culture side that a lot of the magazines have a tendency to do that. You know, like I think that a lot of like sort of like you know, you see those sort of moments bubble up. And I think it's more so about, you know, looking at, I think it's more so about like looking at student papers, because they're doing a good job at this, like of like capturing, right? Like student papers are capturing like those moments of like on the youth culture side. On
Right.
the education journalism side, I think that a lot of education journalists are already doing this, right? Like they are already like, because again there's so few of them, that there are, you know, you have to pick your stories, you have to pick and choose which stories you do. And so I think that there is a tendency to pick the one that has, you know, pick the stories that are better and say something broader. And so I think a lot of education journalists are naturally already doing that.
Are you willing to name some names? I'm going to name a former education reporter who did this, named Linda Lutton, also from Chicago, just by coincidence. She did a radio piece where she went and found chronically absent kids playing basketball on the court. And she recorded the awkwardness of a grown up walking up to kids and saying, hey, what's going on? What schools do you go to? Why don't you go? Amazing journalism. If you're willing, who does this or has done this in ways that are memorable or recommendable to you? I'm always looking for great stories.
Yeah, I'm like blanking on names. I'm blanking on names right now, but I read like a lot. I read like a lot of. I don't, because I'm not local, you know, to somewhere. I read a lot of different people from different places, and so I don't follow necessarily. Not that I don't follow journalists, but I don't, you know, I don't have
Well,
any
if it
names off
comes
the
to
top of my
you,
mind. Yeah, I'll let you know.
that's totally fine. If it comes to
Yeah,
me, or if there's a story topic that sort of
yeah,
uh, fits this, like the 6-7 thing.
yeah.
Let me know now or afterwards. Reflecting back on your experience at the Post, my beef with education journalism, which for the record I love and just want to succeed in every way possible, has been that there are too many of us who had these really awesome educational experiences, too many of us who self-select or are asked to cover schools, had these really positive experiences, frankly, by and large, with schools, and also sort of come from journalism, student journalists, J school graduates, things like that, and that as a result, the coverage ends up being, you know, stale or, you know, grown up. Not that anyone uses that term anymore. I'm curious whether it sounds like you see really cutting edge or informal journalism out there already, and I'm just wondering whether my view of the world and yours are different, which is fine.
Yeah, I think that there is. I think that when I think about education journalism, I do have a tendency to lump education journalism and youth culture coverage together.
Okay.
And that was part of the reason, part of the reason I think that way is because that was sort of how I approached my beat, because right, education journalism is about schools, but it's never just about schools, right? Like it is, and because school isn't just about school, it is about so many other things. And you could write like, that's why I loved the education beat, is you could write about housing or, crime or public, like all of
Yeah.
these things that touch on education. And really it's about young people, like, right? Like it's about, who is in the schools, right? It's about teachers and kids. And so that's why I think that, I sort of lump the two together, is because like youth culture and education journalism like really do overlap to me, like even if
Yeah.
you think on the higher education side, which like this project isn't, but higher
Right.
education journalism, who are you writing about? You're writing about people in their early 20s, and all of these sort of different pieces. And I think that when you talk about youth culture journalism, that is where things are happening, that is sort of, and a little bit more cutting edge, a little bit more experiential, and that's where you sort of see those things, because again, we're trying to tap into the students. And I'm also like I'm a big believer that you can have like the same story with multiple audiences, that not every story has to be for every person.
Right.
um certain stories are just for some people. Like there are needs for the policymakers. Like we do need those straight stories about I wrote a lot of stories about like why am I blanking on the term? Accountability, about school accountability. Wrote a lot about school accountability, which like those are not always, like, those are hard stories to write because they're dense and they're difficult, but like how can we make those accessible to parents, right? Because that's who those stories are for, right? Because those parents want to know about how their school is being how their school is being measured. And then there's stories that are about other things that are for students, and those are for for students who can see themselves in their coverage. And so I'm a big believer of like having different stories for different audiences, and then also repackaging stories. Like you can have the traditional print story that's going to go in the newspaper for your grandma to read, but then you're also going to make that same story and turn it onto a TikTok that your best friend might see, and not
Exactly.
that only grandmas read newspapers, but like
Right.
you know what I mean. Like there are different ways to reach different audiences with the same stories.
I just want to say, though, young people in New York are pulling out copies of the New York Times, printed copies of the New York Times on the subway. I think it's like a stunt or a flex, or like having LPs was 10 years ago. It's just the wildest thing to see people being sort of ostentatiously, if you'll excuse my saying it, post phone. So anyway, everyone, like, some people like to read in print, and some people like to look at things other ways. And what you said about the repackaging, I had the opportunity to interview Sharon Luria from AP the other day. She did a
Mhm.
piece on Lower Merion screen time. She did a straight digital piece, great piece. And then she did, let's call it a TikTok, a vertical video,
Right.
including direct address to the camera, which makes education reporters super, including myself, super nervous. Um, that thing went out to million. That thing was shared so many millions of times, and she was really, she said it was awkward, but happy to get it out to a whole different set of people, and a lot more people than the digital story would have. So I'm with you on repackaging, and I see you on LinkedIn. Maybe you're on other places. You're doing some vertical video as well, right?
I'm trying. Similarly, it is difficult to do. Like it is, and I'm like by no means like an audience engagement journalist. I am just like I'm just a journalist who wants to get work in front of people, and I'm open to trying new things. And there's a lot of people who are working in this space who like this is their whole like their whole world is audience engagement and reaching people. And so I try. I get frustrated doing it because I also consume a lot of vertical video. And I get frustrated because I'm like, some of these are so good. Like these people who are making videos are so talented and I don't have that skill set. And it's like very frustrating to like try to make something. And it's like, oh my God, I just spent 3 hours on this vertical video and, it's, 30 seconds and it's not that good. It's like it's a very frustrating task. So
No, no, it's
I have a lot of admiration for the people who are good at it.
apparently we're not supposed to make these things so polished as we may think or want to make them. I don't know if you saw at EWA, there was a guy from the Banner
Hmm.
talking about video. And he said it sounded like he did some, I'm going to call it fake fumbling at the beginning of his videos, like with the tripod. And people were like, well, why didn't you just cut that out, right? Why not just start with, this is Krishna from the Banner. And he said, no, it's a visual hook. It's authenticity and informality. So maybe it's not as, maybe I'm trying to reassure myself, or maybe it's not as bad as it feels right from the start. I think that people expect the effort, and obviously you'll get better at it. I hope we all get better at it.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I've been trying, like I try because, like you only will get better by practicing, it's old, it's cliche, but like that's the truth. And so yeah, and I do think, and it does reach people, right? Like, and that's the thing isn't about getting wide reach. It's about reaching people that you wouldn't reach otherwise, right? These are people who aren't going to, not always, but like, these are audiences that you're not going to reach in the traditional formats that you would, they probably don't subscribe to your newsletter or to your, your social channels. And I think that especially in journalism, we have a tendency to like, sort of get into our bubbles and, distribute the same things out to the same people. And how can we sort of like break out of that and get our information to new people? And I'm just like, I'm so pro, like, everyone deserves access to free or to not free, everyone deserves access to fair and accurate information. And if that means that I make a video to tell you what's happening in your school system, like that, it takes a couple extra hours out of my week and you get to know what's happening, like that to me is important. Because there is just like so much misinformation online and, stuff that isn't, accurate. And so, doing my very small part to give people something that is accurate.
Before I let you go, and thanks so much for doing this, I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. I'm a big fan of Subway Takes, which everyone likes. I'm also a big fan of journalists like Jenny Abamu at WAMU, who used to be an education reporter. Now she does labor and economics. She's out there doing video on Substack. Is there anyone out there, and I hate to put you on the spot again, and tell me after if it comes to mind after we get off, but is there anyone that you see who's trying to do some version of education journalism, experimenting like you, or maybe they're already fully at it out there already? Is there anyone I should follow? I'm probably not following.
There are a lot of people who are doing the video and experimenting a lot better and more than I am. Like I am barely scratching the surface, and there's a lot of people who are like fully in this and already doing it really well.
Is there anyone from our world, from the journalism world covering education who's made the leap?
Yeah, not necessarily like the journalism or education journalism world, but Chris Vasquez, he was formerly at the Post, and he does really great videos. And we work together. And I like love all of his videos. He's one of those people that I'm like, how do you do this? And he does a lot of stuff that is geared towards young people, and for like teens. And so I think that he's so good at it. Like he's so good at what he does, and has like a ton of just like creative ways of like packaging things. And it is just like really, yeah, his work is awesome.
Excellent. I could ask you questions for the rest of the day, but I promise to keep things short. Karina Elwood from Firsthand, a new student journalism project. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.